colleagues in the world of transfusion medicine. I used to attend these meetings every year, but I haven't since 2006 because I've been more involved recently with stem cell transplantation, cord blood stem cell transplantation. But any of you who remember me, I'd like to have you come say hello and remind me of your name. Well, my primary task today is to honor George Garratty's career. George Garratty, where was the, we can start simply by saying that the world of immunohematology and transfusion medicine lost one of its most popular and productive scientists with the death of George Garratty. He died in March of this year, and but I don't intend this presentation to be a morbid presentation. Instead, let's celebrate the life of George Garratty and his numerous contributions to the field of immunohematology and transfusion medicine. As long as we're going to celebrate his life, we can start fairly early. I think it's remarkable, and it's probably indicative of George's career, that he received a scholarship in early in his life, a scholarship to go to grammar school. That shows how you get a good start in life. That allowed George to attend Stenning Grammar School, and here he is with his colleagues. You may not recognize him, but I'm going to assure that's George Garratty. And this allowed George to live in ancient or historic buildings, and maybe you can recognize him this time. Here he is again with his colleagues. And so these are 13th century buildings, and George enjoyed and always had respect for the history of British society. Well, George's earliest professional training came about in a very unusual and interesting way. One summer he needed a job, so he applied for jobs and happened to accept a job at Hammersmith Hospital in the Royal Postgraduate Medical School of London in the laboratory of two physicians who ultimately became world famous in their fields. The first of these physicians, who I forgot to mention, he also served in the Royal Air Force, and you might pick him out there. No, that's not right. This is George. Anyway, one of the physicians in this research lab that George took, in which George took a summer job, just happened to be Professor John Dacey. Here's Professor Dacey, who was later, incidentally, knighted by the Queen of England to become Professor Sir John Dacey. Here's Professor Dacey with his favorite book. And can you guess what that book is? Well, in keeping with the meticulous nature of Professor Dacey and other English writers, where they write for scientific publications, this just happens to be the Oxford English Dictionary, which, according to the Guinness Book of Records, is the world's most comprehensive single-language print dictionary. This is another picture of George with Professor Dacey and Dacey's wife, Lady Margaret, in Professor Dacey's yard. George became friendly with some of these giants in the field, as illustrated here. The other person, the other physician in the laboratory that George took the summer job in, just happened to be someone who's probably familiar to most of you in transfusion medicine, and that's Pat Mollison. Here's Pat Mollison, who gave George a signed, an autographed copy of his photograph, and here's George with Pat Mollison and one of George's colleagues and longtime friends, Peter Izzet. Well, George was inspired by the contributions of these senior physicians, and this led to decades of research in these fields. George became the chief biomedical scientist of the Hematology and Blood Transfusion Department of the Royal Postgraduate Medical School, and in 1960, a fellow of the Institute of Biomedical Sciences in England. Well, in 1968, George took a position as a research associate at the University of California, San Francisco, a position he held for a decade. Here's George in the laboratory with some of his other staff, including another research associate, Dr. Peter Spott, who was from Austria. And this is in the late 60s and early 70s, and if those of you who are old enough and admit to being old enough to remember those years, you'll recall that that was the height of the hippie era. Well, George did this thing. Here it is in this hippie garb, along with Peter Izzet, who also celebrated that era. And this is another photograph of the two of them in the hippie era. That didn't last forever. In fact, George was also a serious scientist even at that time. And here he is with none other than Herbert Perkins at what was then known as the Irwin Memorial Blood Bank of San Francisco. During this time in San Francisco, George became remarkably productive. And he published articles that would become lifelong interests of his. Now, this is just a short list of what he accomplished in his few years in San Francisco. A book on article on autoimmune hemolytic anemias, alloimmune hemolytic anemias, blood groups and disease, which became one of his favorite subjects, and of course drug-induced hemolytic anemias, to which he contributed much information, and problems with pre-transfusion testing. Here, to inject a little science in the talk for CMEs, George published this drawing of the mechanisms of drug-induced immune hemolytic anemias. The drug attaches to the cell membrane, antibody reacts with the drug, the antibody drug, sometimes the antibodies to the drug and the membrane components, and other times it's mainly to the membrane but also to the drug. Now, in George's remarkably productive time in San Francisco, it began to be evident that all one would need to do was to take reprints of his articles, staple them together, send them to a publisher, and we'd have a book. It wasn't that easy. Again, for those of you who recall those days, there was no internet, there was no typewriters, speedy typewriters, and the job was really with a manual typewriter. And one of the things that came up was checking references. You didn't go to PubMed and check the reference. It wasn't available. And we went to what was known, and probably in your memory you can still recall, was known as a medical library. People know of it, but you don't use it. It's mostly PubMed. Anyway, we finally published the book, and one of the things we want to mention about it is that the names on the covers of books are often names of editors, which means that the editor asks some colleagues of his to send some articles to him, and he reads them over and sends them to the publisher, and you've got a book. But George and I weren't editors, we were authors. So every word in this book was written by George or by me, and we're very, very proud of the book. Okay, and then as George contributed more to the field of hemolytic anemias, it became evident fairly soon that what was needed was a second edition of the book, and ultimately that was published. And here, George and I thought we set a world record in that the time between the first edition and the second edition was 24 years. So if somebody can beat that, we still think we have the work. Well, in 1978, George was recruited to be the scientific director of the American Red Cross Service's Southern California region, and he became clinical professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at the University of California, Los Angeles, sometimes known as UCLA. Here's a picture of George in the early days of that research work at the Red Cross in Los Angeles, Southern California area. And here's George with Nina passed away, Sandra Nance, and Ann Turek and Debbie Brunt. And as sort of implied in this picture, George didn't mind being surrounded by attractive women. But he did get a lot of work done. And here are the beginning of a list of some of his references. ABL blood groups in relationship to disease. He was one of the people who really put this topic on the map. Laboratory investigation of drug-induced immune-mediated we've already mentioned. The clinical significance of antibodies, clinically significant and insignificant ones, and the investigation of a positive direct antiglobulin test in immune-mediated medias. Well, the antiglobulin test is, of course, a critical test, and George studied it in detail, and was a very sensitive test known as the complement-fixing antiglobulin consumption test. He demonstrated that the antiglobulin test would be negative as long as there were fewer than 120 molecules of IgG in a red cell. After that, the antiglobulin test did become positive. Here then are some of the publications of George while he was in Southern California at the American Red Cross and as you might imagine, there are hundreds of publications, so I can't really go into great detail, but just mention some of the things that are quite interesting. He published a prediction of clinical significance of antibodies and determining the in vivo survival of transfused red cells, immune cytopenias associated with antibiotics, application of flow cytospectrometry, and mechanisms of in vivo cell destruction. And here again, we can satisfy our CME people. Here's a slide showing the later reacting components of complement attaching to the earlier components of complement, producing what is known as the membrane attack complex, which causes the destruction of the cell. More publications. Detection of alloantibodies in patients with antibody autoimmune hemolytic anemias, which is a difficult and very sophisticated topic. And blood groups and disease, here he's already reporting a historical perspective, and erythrophagocytosis on the peripheral blood smear and periplasmal cold hemoglobinuria. Well, in addition to the 350 publications in highly respected medical journals, Dr. Garratty was the author of 3 books and also been the editor of 8 books, including Blood Groups, Antigens and Disease, Hemolytic Diseases of the Newborn, Immunobiology of Transfusion Medicine, Applications of Molecular Biology to Blood Transfusion Medicine, and Molecular Methods in Immunohematology. In the face of all these contributions to the medical literature, it's interesting that one of the things that George was most proud of was his teaching. He was recognized as an enthusiastic and energetic lecturer and provided valuable data in a readily understandable form. And this led him to be invited to give talks to local students and colleagues, but more generally throughout the state and eventually around the country, and as I'll demonstrate, around the world. And on the bottom of this slide we mentioned that he received the James Blundell Award in 2007, and that was one of the things he was very proud of because of 2 reasons. First of all, it's a very prestigious award, and here he is giving the acceptance award at the British Society of Transfusion Medicine. George was proud because it was a prestigious award, and also it demonstrated international recognition of his work. Now, this wasn't the only award that George received. In fact, here's an interesting picture, I think, of the wall in George's office of all these awards. There are too numerous to mention, but I will go through some of them. The Ivor Dunsford Memorial Award, the Emily Cooley Memorial Award, the Morton Grove Rasmussen Award of the AABB, the Owen Thomas Memorial Award of the CBBS, the Charles Drew Award of the American Red Cross, and the Philip Levine Outstanding Research Award of the American Society of Cosmetologists, and also then the Bernard Fantas Lifetime Achievement Award of the AABB. It's worth mentioning that award because it is not an annual award. The award is given only when a physician or scientist is recognized as being outstanding, and it's only been given about 5 times, and since its inception in 1987. One of the previous awardees, of course, was Dr. Perkins. So, along with the awards that you can put on your wall, you get a few medals. These are the James Bungle Award, the Bernard Fantas Award, and the Philip Levine Award, and again, the Fantas and Levine Award, and a couple of other awards from the ABB. This final one, I think, is from Switzerland. Well, George gave lectures throughout the world, as we mentioned, and when you travel around the world, you frequently take a camera with you, and so here are some shots of George at places where he gave talks. This happens to be in Thailand, and it's an interesting photo, and when you're in Thailand, you might as well travel around like people in Thailand do. And here he is with his wife, take a little hike with an elephant. Here's George in Japan, in a lecture series there, and here's George Garratty giving a talk. And I'm not very good at translating Japanese, but I'll just bet that this is Dr. George Garratty. If there's someone who speaks who is fluent in Japanese correctly, please do. And when you're in Japan, you might as well become acquainted with some of the locals, and George didn't miss a chance. Things went on from there to Egypt. George and his wife Eileen, and here they are again in a very ornate room in Egypt, and here he is in South Africa. South Africa's a long way from Egypt, but George got involved in what looks like drinking blood, but I think they put a little wine in those bags instead. And finally, there's a group of researchers that emigrated from England to the United States that formed a little group of their own, which eventually became known as the English Mafia. And I thought we had a photograph of them. Not yet. Okay, well, in spite of all these travels and all the contributions to the medical literature, George also found time to be on local, national, and international committees. Here he was program chairman of the CBBS, AAB's Scientific Program Committee, was a member of the Ad Hoc Consultant to Blood Products Advisory Committee of the FDA, president of the California Blood Bank System, on the NIH Hematology Study Section, the regional counselor of the International Society of Blood Transfusion Council, and the AABB Transfusion Medicine Research Strategies Committee. It's kind of overwhelming to think you can do all those things, but they did get done. And George became acquainted with the giants of the field, and of course became one himself. But here he is with Paul Engelfried, and again Pat Mollison. And here Dr. Rayson Sanger, and Philip Levine, and this is the British Mafia, one of the raucous parties at the AABB. Eileen, his wife, decided not to go to those parties. Well, but in spite of all what we've said about his scientific accomplishments, there's a human side to George And here he is with his lovely wife of 45 years, Eileen Garratty. And when George traveled in England, he frequently took time to go to one of the cathedral towns with their beautiful scenery and nature and just a beautiful environment that George was inspired by. He always had a soft spot in his heart for anything British. Here's George with some Great Dane dogs. And George and Eileen both loved animals, and Great Dane dogs were one of them. Another animal that, in fact, George and Eileen, all the time they've lived in Southern California, have lived with 2 Great Dane dogs in their home. That shows the person in the family who developed the greatest interest in time with horses. And she developed an interest in competitive dressage. The dressage is an equestrian sport, which is considered the highest expression of horse training. And she's won competitive honors in that field. And in fact, she still rides almost daily on her horse. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of that. And if you're going to go fishing, you might as well catch a fish. And here's George with a 30-pound salmon that he caught. And finally, we can show him cross-country skiing. So I believe that we'll all agree that George's death indeed does mark the end of an era of hematology and transfusion medicine. Thank you. Ross?
Thank you, Dr. Petz. I was asked to be able to give a little tribute to George, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and so I do have some disclosures. This is actually on FCME talk, right? So you have to have disclosures. We're going to honor today two giants in transfusion medicine, and here are my disclosures about George. I'm a big fan of George. I've been a friend of his for 27 years. I've been his colleague for 27 years, and I'll be his student forever. I do want to mention one other disclosure that's not listed, and that's that Kathy Walden and Roger Dodd had the idea, when George announced his retirement, to get thoughts, videos, photos from around the world to share with George, because he was ill at the time. And we put together a Dropbox account, and they sent it to my email, rather than to the Dropbox account, but then we lit it up to the Dropbox account as well. So a lot of the thoughts and photos I'm going to be using have come from people from around the world in respect to George. And the last thing, the hook for my talk, is remember the smile. Remember the smile. Okay, the early years for George began in the Battle of Britain era in World War II. He would tell us stories about German bombers coming over, bombing the surrounding area, and he and his buddies would run out and play in the bomb craters. I thought, well, it's pretty lucky we actually had George survive to make it into grammar school at that point. He never really wanted to be a transfusion medicine specialist. He wanted to be a veterinarian. So he applied to the Royal Veterinary College in London, but serendipity was on transfusion medicine's side. Students at the time had to do 2 years of military service. So he wanted a summer job while waiting to go into the Army, and the summer job took him into the labs of Dacey and Mollison. And so serendipity is a good thing, and veterinary medicine's loss was transfusion medicine's gain. He emigrated to the United States and came into San Francisco in 1968, wanted to spend 2 years to do research on complement with Dr. Petz. He stayed for 10 years in San Francisco. She must have liked San Francisco quite a bit, and was quite productive, as we've seen by Dr. Petz. He gave, in 1972, according to that picture, at the Gamma seminar as part of the South Central Association of Blood Banks talk, he gave a blood groups and disease talk. The exact same talk he was going to present today, if he'd accepted the award today. Well, not the exact same talk, of course. Things have changed since 1972. He honed that talk for many, many years. And in fact, the most recent time that he gave that was at the Novartis industry seminar at the ABB meeting in Denver, Colorado last fall. So he worked hard at updating that talk, but it's something that stuck with him since 1972. He transferred from San Francisco to LA because he was asked and recruited to become a new Red Cross researcher in LA to put LA Red Cross on the map. He became the scientific director of the Red Cross Blood Services. And as mentioned, he was clinical professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at UCLA. In his role as scientific director, he was the director of the Immunohematology Reference Lab, the HLA Platelet Immunology Lab, and the research department, a small but very productive research department, and an SBB program. And the SBB program had two different lives. It had an early life which led to many trainees coming through the program, and then there weren't quite as much demand for SBBs at the time, so the program died a slow death. But it was resurrected recently, and it's still active today in our Pomona headquarters in Southern California. He spent just a few years in LA, and I want to point out in the upper left-hand corner, that's the Vermont Avenue LA headquarters. It's no longer there, it's now a police station that's been built around it. But just check out the vegetation, first of all. So there's not too much vegetation going on there, right, in that picture. The other pictures are some folks up in the right-hand corner. I happen to be in that picture. That's the Breakfast Club. That was a time where the managers would all meet at the time of breakfast and talk about strategy and tactics in this competitive world of blood banking, and George was a member of that particular Breakfast Club. In the lower right-hand corner, you see Jay Olmsted, ex-CEO of the region, also CBBS president at one point. And then in the lower left-hand corner, we have Dan Connor when he was CEO of Southern California region, now CEO and president of Blood Systems. And next to Dan Connor, you can see Shirley Kenworthy, a past president of the CBBS as well. So just a few years in LA, you can see that the vegetation has taken over the building at this point. And upper right-hand corner is George put on a seminar for Art Silverglad upon his retirement. Those are the speakers at the seminar. We attracted about 500 people to the seminar. We held it on the campus of Cal Poly Pomona. A very successful seminar, and Art was forever grateful for the send-off that he had gotten from George. The Breakfast Club down in the right-hand corner, again, not having breakfast this time. And then some of the members from the research lab and from the reference lab over on the left-hand side, plus our community education coordinator at one point. And as I said, just a few years in LA, this is the next iteration of the management group. For those of you who know Jerry Collins, he's over there on the far left. George is on the far left in the back. Jay Olmsted was the CEO, and that's the members of some of the members of the management group, some of which have been active CBBS members as well. And then we moved to Pomona. Up in the left-hand corner is the first blood that was ever received at the new Pomona facility back in March of 2005. Up on the right, that's my 50th birthday. So he was roasting me at the time. He was good at roasting me, actually. And in the lower left-hand corner, that's the first class of the new SBB program. And you can see the people holding the two plaques. One of them is Kate Hernandez on the right. She was one of the first graduates of the program. And so Mike Cooper was the program coordinator, I was the program medical director, and George was the program director. On the right-hand side is the most recent class of the SBB program. Kate is actually presenting the plaques. She's now the program coordinator, George program director, and next to him is Joy Friday as program medical director. So we've had multiple programs of SBB students that have come through, and we've been pretty productive over the last few years, and we hope the program keeps going into the future. The research team over the years didn't change a bit. From the 1970s on the upper left to the 1980s on the right, to the 1990s on the lower left, and then finally into the 2000s on the bottom right. Not a change at all. You can see Pat Arndt there, he's in the crowd today as well. Gina Leger, Nana Postaway was mentioned. Ann Tunick is long-term administrative assistant, over 30 years of service to George. They had a special relationship that sort of transcended business, and they were great friends as well. He was a prolific contributor to the medical literature. As mentioned, he had tons of publications, more than 300 publications. He was a long-time associate editor of Transfusion. And for the period 1999 to 2004, they did some statistical manipulations of what was published. George was number 4 on the list as total publications in Transfusion. Mike Bush led the list, but okay. Sue Straber got number 3, and I don't know who number 2 was. But so those are good quality folks to be in rubbing elbows with as far as making quality contributions to the medical literature. As mentioned, he won a number of awards, 2 American Red Cross Awards, the Charles Drew Award in 1987, and the Graham Jameson Lectureship Award in 2006, and that's Graham Jameson presenting the award to George. Numerous awards from other associations such as New York Blood Center, South Central Association of Blood Banks, American Society of Clinical Pathologists, and NIH with the Richard Davey Lectureship Award in 2006. And there was an international flavor as well, as was mentioned, that he won the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service Ian Cook Memorial Award, and one he really treasured was the James Blundell Award of the British Blood Transfusion Society. He was an active member of ABB, participating in a number of committees, a number of program committees, and then winning a number of awards, receiving a number of awards. In 1978, he received the Ivor Dunsford Memorial Award. He, in 1989, received from Larry Sherman up there in the right-hand corner, he got the Emily Pooley Memorial Award. And then in 1994, the Morton Grove Rasmussen Memorial Award from Charlie Wallace, president at the time. George and Dr. Petz received that award. And then finally, the Bernard Fantis Medal Lifetime Achievement Award back in 2010, which is extremely a special award to George, and I believe also to Larry Petz, they just vote. At the CBBS, he provided a lot of service to this particular organization. This picture here is from 1985 when he was the CBBS president. He didn't change much over the years, and I said, one of the hooks I said was, remember the smile. And if you noticed each picture along the way, that smile has followed him the entire way through this entire talk. He was an Owen Thomas Award winner in 1987. He was the first year of the award for the Ledeen Lecture Award in 2004. And finally this year, 2014, is the Scientific Lecture and Award winner for the Perkins Award. Judy Parker shared some thoughts with us when she was participating to the Dropbox effort. And he is still with us today. You can read the slide. I thought I'd let you know that one of the reasons we're back in Tahoe is because George once told me he loves this venue. It makes us all relaxed, makes us, our personalities come out better, and I wish you could have seen it one more time. And I think when everybody in the audience would share that sentiment, that we wish you could have seen it one more time. But he is actually still with us today. His favorite things in the entire world were Eileen, his wife, and the boys, his Great Danes. That picture on the upper left, he had actually had on his hard drive on his computer. It was called Eileen in the Middle. That was the title. It's just for a few years ago, not too many. And then the picture that he had next to his door, which he looked out from his office, this was the picture that he looked out, knowing that Eileen and the dogs waited for him at home. So his favorite thing in the entire world were Eileen and his boys. But if he couldn't be with Eileen and his boys, he liked to be among transfusion medicine and blood banking colleagues, like Dick Asper, Larry Petz, Scott Murphy, a whole host of other folks such as Harvey Klein, Ed Snyder, Jeff McCullough, the departed Margot Crisco, Raja Tovian, Jim Aubuchon, the British Mafia as they grew up out of the hippie age and became Immunohematology Incorporated. We threw Phyllis Walker in there too. She's not British, but what the heck? She's honorary British for today. Our Ledeen Award winner from this year's CBBS. And Patricia Tippett, Marion Reed, John Semple, and Jill Story. He loved to be around his colleagues. This is from a 2011 CBBS meeting when Sonny Zeke won the Ledeen Award. That's Marissa Lee in the middle. And then George and they were having a good time at the President's reception. The reason I have this is because this leads into another slide, and everyone has a dark side. Even George has a dark side. Mark Twain said everyone's a moon and has a dark side, which he never shows to anybody. This is George Garratty's dark side. Lord, clean and body. So I mentioned we got some thoughts around the world and some pictures. Nobody sent video, but well, we have it loaded up the Dropbox. And so for the final portion of my presentation, I'm just going to turn to their thoughts. And you can read as the slides progress through, but here's some thoughts about George Garratty.
And the dreams that you dream of, dreams really do come true. Someday wish upon a star, wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where trouble melts like lemon drops, high above the chimney top. That's where you find me, oh, somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly, and the dream that you dare to go on.
So we're going to miss George, but we're going to remember his smile. Always remember that smile. And for now, Dora's going to present to him.
Stop it.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to give this award to Mrs. Garratty. This is, I'm sorry, this is the award, the Scientific Lectureship Award presented to George Garratty by Blood Systems in recognition of his active involvement in education, training, research, and the practice of scientific nature pertaining to transfusion medicine. And also I would like to share with all of you that with permission of Eileen and the Perkins family, we are renaming this lectureship and award the Herb Perkins and George Garratty Award.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Larry, for the wonderful presentation. I know you went to a lot of trouble, and George and Larry were friends for 50 years, so it's a long relationship. And Ross, you know, has been more than great for him. The presentation was wonderful, and thank you for the Dropbox. And hopefully I'll get organised enough to get access to it. And it's interesting, I don't know if Dr. Shah's still here, but it's, you know, I worked in research as well, but I was a white cell person. So I always thought red cells were really boring. And I worked on Hodgkin's lymphomas and leukemia and later HIV. But so his talk was very interesting. And when George was in hospital, his hemoglobin went down to 6 and they wanted to transfuse him. And he didn't want a transfusion because he knew of all the complications that they had. So he was fighting with all the doctors, and he sent me home to print out the latest. I didn't think of that till Dr. Shah's presentation. And the other thing Larry was saying about the book, you know, right till the end, George wrote with a number 3 pencil on a yellow pad. You know, he was totally computer illiterate, absolutely useless around the house. And Anne, who was his administrative secretary for over 30 years, you know, he used to, you know, all through our married life, when we were in San Francisco, the evenings, George worked. He had to review papers, do this, do that. And then in later life, with a long commute to Pomona, he worked at weekends. And, you know, his writing got worse and worse, and Anne could still read it and translate the whole thing. And when he worked, many of you didn't know, he loved music. We had a little house at the end of the garden, and he had, you know, very eclectic taste. You know, I would hear Billie Holiday and Joe Williams, and then Janis Joplin and Creedence Clearwater, or Adele, or Nora, whatever her name is. And, you know, I couldn't understand because he'd be reviewing papers and writing, and there was all this noise going on. You know, which for me, I have to have quiet if I read anything, but he loved it, and he, you know, he always said the great loves of his life were work and me. And, you know, I don't think there's many people who can get into their 70s and wake up in the morning and be happy and joyous to go to work. You know, he got the stimulation and excitement from it, and he enjoyed all the people, and you know, he was blessed in that. You know, he had a great life, really, George. And you know, I try and think always of, I have this little thing in my car that says, live with a grateful heart. So, you know, I'm very grateful George had such a good life that he enjoyed, and he died very peacefully when he was at home. And I had Pandora playing all the time, so there was all this old 1930, 40 jazz going for him. But, you know, I have to thank you all for, you know, giving him such joy and happiness. Thank you.